Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this seminar, A European War in Ukraine, Geopolitical and Economic Consequences for the European Union. My name is Koldo Echebarria. I am the Director General of Esade, and it will be my pleasure to moderate this panel. Let me first of all thank my colleagues from Esade Geo, from the Esade Center for the Global Economy and Geopolitics, and from Esade Pol, our Center for Economic Policy, for organizing this interesting webinar. And I also want to thank the colleagues who are with me today in this webinar. First of all, Elina Ribakova, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute of International Finance. Welcome, Elina, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. Gracias.
And also Jan Wouters, who is a full professor and Jan Monnet Chair at the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies and also International Relations. Thank you, Jan, for joining us today. Very happy to have here with you today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Well, it is obvious that the war in Ukraine is a milestone, a very worrying, tragic milestone in the evolution of Europe. I don't think anybody of us could think that we will be facing a war in the middle of the continent at this stage, but it is a difficult reality that we have to face and to analyze all the implications that it has, strong implications both from the economic, from the political, and from the international relations point of view. It is to be seen to what extent this war will change the European Union, but there are signs that a lot of changes are going to be introduced looking into the future. Let me start with a general question for each of our guests so they can provide an introduction of their thinking about the war. And let me start with Elina. Elina, what do you think is the most relevant economic implication for the war in terms of the European Union?
I think the most relevant economic implication of the war is the way we think about economic sovereignty of the European Union. And it is a sort of relatively recently revived concept. And of course, the European Commission now talks about it being geopolitical, and we might hear this concept more frequently. But we will need to incorporate that into our way of economic thinking, how we think about the cost of energy in Europe. You know, it will forever have to include the higher price because of the sovereignty and security of supply, ethic considerations around the supply. So that would probably the most important one would be, in addition, of course, to lower growth and likely high inflation.
Yeah, thank you, Elina. And of course, sovereignty is a very strong concept always. And we have been, to some extent, with globalization and especially European integration, like running away from sovereignty. And here it comes back. Jan, what is your quick reaction on the implications from the point of view of international relations of this war?
Well, speaking of sovereignty, you know, sovereignty also means that you have to respect another country's sovereignty. And that is really laid down in the United Nations Charter since 1945, which says explicitly that countries should refrain from using force against each other's territorial integrity, against each other's political independence. They should even refrain from threatening to use force. What we have been seeing here since the 27th of February, or the 24th of February rather, is really a case of very brutal military aggression of one country against another country in blunt violation of the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, of international law. And unfortunately, in the 56 days that this conflict has been raging, we have been seeing an enormous amount of war crimes, and I would even say crimes against humanity, being committed by Russian troops against not just Ukrainian fighters, but also against the Ukrainian civilian population, which has triggered also, as you may know, investigations before the International Criminal Court. So we are seeing something quite remarkable. I I would basically say it's more or less of the size of a 9/11 type of systemic shock to the international system. And that's also why the European heads of state and government, when they met in Versailles in the beginning of March, they really said this is a tectonic shift in European history.
Yes, that is clear. I think it has obvious implications from an economic point of view in the short term. We are facing more inflation because of the war. We may also face difficulties in our supply lines, also because of the war. What are your main worries in the short term, Elina, in terms of the economic consequences for the Union of the war?
Well, my immediate near-term concerns are about higher commodity prices. And we're talking a lot about energy, but we also should be talking about food crisis, food crisis, particularly for lower income and emerging markets, including in Africa, North Africa particularly, but MENA, across the globe, and then of course inevitably will have an impact on Europe. Another concern that I have is what impact, and we started talking about sovereignty and the war crimes that Jan mentioned, what impact will also have on European plans for defense. Of course, NATO is more united than ever now, but what also Europe should be thinking independently in terms of potential threats, continuous threats from Russia, even though we might have some sort of an agreement, how lasting that agreement might be in Ukraine.
Let me go a little bit on the issue of prices and monetary policy, because what we see in Europe is like a more moderate stance to combat inflation compared with the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve is already acting, I would say, aggressively against inflation, and we see much more nuanced reaction here by the European Central Bank. What do you think about that? Do you think that this war may change the stand of the European Central Bank? Do you think that this could have also consequences in relation to the fiscal framework of the monetary union?
Well, I think it is all data dependent. I think what the ECB was trying to say in different words, two things. One is we really don't know what's happening. And second is very much data dependent, which is not the best way probably of reassuring the markets. But it is something that most of the global central banks are finding themselves in, particularly in the developed markets. And as you mentioned, the Fed, that is potentially already behind the curve. Even before the shock from prices, the economy was recovering very strongly post-COVID, coming out of COVID. You had very stimulative fiscal and monetary policy at the same time. Inevitably, you have high inflation, and the Fed is somewhat behind the curve. The Fed thinks, I think, relatively more about financial markets than the ECB has to think about financial markets for different reasons. So therefore, we do expect the Fed still to be cautious. And therefore, it gives also room for ECB to be cautious. Whether this is the absolutely right policy at the moment, I am not certain. But I think it again depends on what's happening with the war and potential further sanctions on energy.
Okay, and let's move into another topic we have. It has a lot of fiscal implications as well, which is defense policy. And Jan, we have seen here some movements from important countries in the European Union committing more resources into defense. We have also seen European commissioners, the European Vice President Josep Borrell, responsible for foreign policy, saying that the European Union needs a stronger commitment to defense. How do you see this evolving? Do you think these commitments are the sign of a new era? Or do you believe that if the war fades, we will forget about this commitments soon?
I think indeed we are in a completely different era, both for international relations. Think of the whole implication for Russia's participation and our cooperation with Russia in global international institutions, but especially also for the European integration project. We are already, as a European Union, we are far more than an internal market, as you know. We have the Lisbon Treaty, which has given us stronger foundations for a common foreign and security policy, even with the prospect of a common defense policy. And I think that what now has happened, and keeping also in mind that this is not entirely new. We had the invasion of Georgia in the summer of 2008. We had the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, the war in eastern Ukraine. I mean, what now has happened is, of course, of a much faster scale. But if anything, it, I think, really has alerted the EU that we have to absolutely be vigilant about the need for bolstering our defense capabilities in a coordinated manner, of course, also in relationship always to NATO. But it has also really triggered an enormous debate about energy independence and about other forms of, let's say, strengthening our common policies. I mean, if you read the so-called Versailles Declaration, that was the informal summit of heads of state and government that President Macron convened in Versailles. And that declaration is pretty strong in terms of, let's say, the enormous emphasis on not just bolstering defense capabilities, although it's not very much quantified what they are going to do. There is going to be a special summit of the European Council in the near future about this, but also really this emphasis on reducing our energy dependencies on Russia. That's really, taking high speed, and you see all countries really now doing this strategic thinking. Remember last week, Prime Minister Draghi went to Algeria to have contracts on gas supply and so on and so forth. Every country is now really looking to diversify its energy resources, and that too is going to be an enormous effort for the European Union.
Let me insist on the defense issue, because we're coming from the crisis in Afghanistan that did not leave a very good taste on European countries about the role of NATO and the behavior of the US. This is something different, and we see a strong coordination between the US and Europe, and also a certain atmosphere of reinforcement and enlargement of NATO with some countries that have been so far apart from the organization. Do you believe this will be the case looking into the future? More European-US coordination, NATO, countries joining NATO to feel better protected?
Well, one thing I think is certain, you cannot say anymore about NATO that it is brain dead. As President Macron said a couple of years ago, NATO is really alive and kicking, and is more alive and kicking than ever before, because basically what we see happening now are the worst case scenarios of the Cold War. They're all coming back. So NATO has really shown its relevance, not just for all the existing members in NATO who feel really glad that they are part of the alliance, but also look at the North, look at the enormous change in public opinion in Finland. Sweden is probably following, but I mean, this has really triggered an enormous, let's say, new dynamic for NATO. Whether we are able to keep that dynamic will really much depend on the political will of all of the actors, in the very first place, the United States. Let's not forget that, presidents come and go, Congresses come and go, and there are important midterm elections later this year and so on. So things are maybe not that certain in the long term, but what we really now see is a very concerted effort to really bring the West together, because let's call it like that. We have seen here a couple of weeks ago something quite unique in Brussels, where we saw 3 important summits, with the American president joining the G7 summit, a NATO summit, and a European Council meeting where the American president really came. I think the US administration has really been a quick learner from some of the, let's say, mistakes or unfortunate unilateral actions that were taken with regard to the departure of Afghanistan, also with regard to this deal with Australia and the UK, the AUKUS deal that fell very badly within the European Union. So they have really learned, and they are really acting in a very skillful manner being able to forge a strong sense of unity among Western countries and beyond, I should say.
Let me move now to the issue of sanctions, economic sanctions, the economic weapon, as has been characterized. Elina, what's your analysis of the sanctions that have been imposed to Russia? how do you assess their effectiveness in terms of trying to finish with this war?
Well, I'm very glad that we're all together in this panel, because sanctions assessment of effectiveness of sanctions requires a multidisciplinary approach. So in economics, we're sitting there on one rails like a trap. We think about, oh, this is the effectiveness, right? But what is really happening with economic statecraft, which is sort of a mix of tools and a mix of objectives. And objectives can be in foreign policy, in national security, defense, economics. And we do need definitely frameworks, and I don't think they exist yet, of how to assess, how to model the interaction between the statecraft and the final objective. In terms of effectiveness of sanctions, narrowly defined, imposing cost on the government, they're imposing the cost. Imposing the cost on the Russian economy, we see that, and we can spend more time talking about it. I think it's very important. But in terms of other objectives, whether it might be regime change or preventing or stopping Russia or deterring Russia from waging the war on the ground, with the war with sanctions, it is very hard to say that we've achieved any of those objectives. Even if you look at the past literature on sanctions, generally it's very hard to find empirical evidence that, and relationships are usually very tenuous from the effect of the sanctions to any other more ambitious objectives like regime change, for example. It is also very interesting, just like in central bank communication, which we used to discuss constructive or destructive ambiguity some 20, 30 years ago, well, we potentially need the same debate on sanctions. Do we want to clearly articulate the objectives when we're imposing the sanctions, so there is a clear off-ramp, or do we want to make it ambiguous? In the case of Ukraine, we maybe want to say, okay, we want to make it explicit, but then what kind of room for negotiations we're leaving on the ground in Ukraine? So I think these are all very important policy and research questions that I'm so glad that our students are listening to, because they will have to be thinking about it. In terms of the impact on the economy, I think Russia, the central bank, produced a very skillful response. So we do have to say we had runs on the system in the early days. We had pressure on the ruble, but with the capital controls, liquidity provision, and also hiking of rates, the response has been uniquely appropriate and skilled, especially compared to previous Russia's crisis. Still, of course, it will have an impact on financial conditions. It will have an impact on confidence in Russia, and that will weigh through the economy. But I think the most important impact of sanctions and self-sanctioning will be the lack of imported components coming to Russia. And I think you see that from some obvious places where the foreign car manufacturers are withdrawing, and it's very clear that big parts of the sort of regions will come to a standstill, and all the supporting industries as well. We know that a few months from now, these employers will not get salary or the job, so that is closed, and the supporting industry. But then we'll start finding out industry by industry where the components are missing. And these are not just high-tech components. This can be very small parts. We hear stories about maybe small part. Russia can perfectly produce it, but it is needed for such a small number of enterprises. It's not economical to produce. This is all about international trade, right? All the benefits of international trade. So disentangling the country and restarting it, as President of Russia, Putin said, USSR used to live under sanctions and achieved great success. So trying to achieve that great success again, will be very painful for the economy.
Yeah, and let me ask you, because this time new types of sanctions have been adopted, like freezing the central bank assets or even expelling Russian banks from the SWIFT system. How do you assess that, if you want to leap forward in terms of especially financial sanctions? Because another thing has been that companies have followed without even being mandated to stop business in Russia. That's not something that was within the sanctions, but this is also new. How do you assess this reinforced approach to economic sanctions?
So I think there are two issues. One issue is that financial sanctions effectively have begun to turn into trade sanctions. So it's very hard, even within the sanctions, to stay in one lane. So de-swifting some of the Russian central banks made it effectively difficult to trade, and sort of resulted in sort of trade sanction. Another aspect is overcompliance. And I do not always think that the government do it by design. I think they design the sanctions, they try to forecast intended, unintended consequences of their measure. But this is one aspect where they have a blind spot. They really do not know how much overcompliance they're going to have from sanctions. And it is specifically in the case of Russia's war in Ukraine, of course, the reputational risk and the fact that Russia is toxic and countries just choose to withdraw, not even just out of overcompliance, but because of the ideological and sort of strong stance that they're taking by withdrawing from operations with Russia. So in terms of financial sanctions, I think the biggest important sort of takeaway is that we indeed have moved to the frontier of the financial sanctions. The reserves which Russia built as part of the Fortress Russia strategy were completely undermined. The strategy was undermined and was broken. And I think that's definitely a sign of success. Of course, it will also will force other countries to think twice. What does it mean, reserves? Accessible and liquid? Well, apparently not anymore, right? So that will have some repercussions there. And the next step in sanctions, I think all of us will spend time, and I was very sort of curious by Jan's comments as well, is the energy sanctions from Europe. And here, the sort of for Europe not to be a fragmented power will be very important. So I'm very curious how this economic sanctions and the governance will interact in this respect.
Yeah, because it is a sort of contradiction to apply these very strong economic and financial sanctions, but still keeping open the door of gas and oil imports in Europe as it is. I mean, we are, with one hand, taking resources from the Russian economy, but from the other hand, giving these same resources to continue with the war. What do you think about that? Do we need to move more aggressively into the sanctions of oil and gas imports?
Well, I think it is indeed a tectonic shift. Europe relied on Russia's supply of energy even through the Soviet times, and it was reliable enough, right? It was inexpensive, reliable enough when Europe wanted to move from the long-term contracts to spot contracts with Gazprom. Gazprom eventually grudgingly, but obliged. So even when Turkey had an issue with Russia, Russia continued to supply to them. Of course, it continues to supply to Ukraine still now. Do we need to shift? Clearly, we're talking about national security issues here, NATO. We're talking about how economics can inform foreign policy and defense policy, and vice versa. So at the moment, we have sort of Ukrainians defending European democracy, and at the same time, we're trading to have a transaction with Russian gas and oil. The issue here is that it has to be thought through process that has long-term implications. There is no point of trying to go sort of, I think, cold turkey now, and then finding out that it's actually not operationable, and then come winter having to reverse to some sort of compromise with Russia. This will be the worst possible scenario to me. However, should we be preparing aggressively for cold turkey scenarios? Well, yes, of course, because we shouldn't forget that there are also possibilities of contra-sanctions from Russia. There is the issue of Russia asking for payments in rubles. I think they're going to blink first on this one. But as we know, European Union said, look, we do not want to do that. We find it's breach of sanctions potentially, even though Hungary says that it will do that. So I think this will be on the agenda for years to come. And the sooner we start working and preparing the right measures and commitments to reduce reliance on Russian oil products, then oil, and then gas, well, in parallel, but I'm just going from the easier to the more complicated, the better it will be for our national economic security.
Yeah, and Jan, these sanctions are unilateral. They have not been agreed in the framework of any international organizations. In the past, we have seen sanctions agreed in the context of the UN, not in this case. How do you assess this in the context of our international order? What is the impact? What do you see the future of these looking into the future?
Well, let me start by saying that it's really a very comprehensive and unique package of sanctions that has been developed now in 5 stages by the European Union. The 5th package was just adopted weeks ago, and this will continue. And so also the coordination between actors, the United States, other Western countries, the UK, and so on, is very big. So, I mean, yes, you could say there is an enormous effort to make those sanctions really bite. And again, they are designed to, as such, weaken the economic base of Russia, depriving it of certain, important technological tools, but also curtailing its ability to wage war. Now, curtailing the ability to wage war, as we are still paying billions of euros a day for Russian gas and oil supplies. I mean, that's a little bit not yet an achieved kind of objective. It shows basically that is the way to go for the future if we really want to hit them in their capacity to wage war. But to be very honest, sanctions have always been a long-term instrument, and we tend to forget this in the West, where usually as Western democracies, we're a little bit short-termist, so we always are impatiently looking for quick results and effects from sanctions. History shows that it's not like that regimes can go on for a very long time, even with very strict sanction schemes, that all kinds of alternative supply routes and smuggling and what have you will be created. That sanctions are in any event a leaky business. The packages themselves are, of course, always a political compromise. You can be sure that certain member states have asked for exemptions for this or that particular industry, but also the implementation, the actual application of the sanctions by individual countries is sometimes really deficient. It's difficult to oversee this in great detail. But then, I mean, think back of international relations like 40, 50 years ago, when, for instance, the world was fairly united in having sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Well, it took decades before the regime collapsed. And in fact, you wonder whether the main forces for that collapse were due to the sanctions or rather to internal changes within society. So it's a very uncertain type of business. It's definitely not rocket science, the sanctions. And let's also not forget that sanctions can be very inequitable. They can be very unfair also in their implications for very vulnerable parts of the population. So, I mean, I think it's very important for us to continue to assess what we are adopting and not just have like this big kind of announcement. Yes, the sixth package of sanctions and ever more people on the lists and the daughters of Putin and so on and so forth. It sounds all very nice, but in a certain way, sanctions are, in any event, in the short term, I think they will not change the behavior immediately. It could well be that in the long term, they may have big political and economic effects. But I mean, we have to be patient with that. And I think if the war continues, because that's the big fear now, that the war will not have a quick end, that it may drag on, that it may lead to a very messy, blurred situation. I mean, we know already in that area that there are lots of so-called frozen conflicts, which then time and depending on the context flare up again. So I mean, we don't know when the war is going to end. We don't know whether Russia may have recourse to certain weapons of mass destruction. Just imagine that certain tactical nuclear weapons would be used on certain Ukrainian cities, what this will do with not just Ukraine, but also with the reactions of the West. We are currently delivering ever more, let's say, weapons, lethal weapons. Even the European Union has now used already 1.5 billion euros from the so-called European Peace Facility to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine. From an international law point of view, I can also tell you there is a lot of discussion about the question whether if you supply such lethal weapons, whether you are still really outside of the conflict yourself. You know, there are certain interpretations in international law that says you are becoming a party in the conflict. And that, of course, at a certain moment can really become a very, very risky affair for especially the European countries.
Let me, in relation to this, comment on the role of the UN. I have heard very strong criticism to the UN architecture in the context of this war. It is unprecedented that a permanent member of the Security Council waves war against another member of the UN. And in fact, it seems that Russia is pressing very strongly in the UN not to get involved in any aspect of the war. Is that marking, let's say, a critical point for the UN organization as we have known it?
No, absolutely. As you rightly say it, this is a permanent member of the Security Council, one of the countries that founded the United Nations on the ashes of the Second World War. And I mean, so it's hugely problematic in the very first place, because such a country can really block any action by the Security Council. Now, the good news about the UN is that it's not just the Security Council, and that there are other bodies in the whole system that have really worked and that are really doing important things. Let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, the General Assembly, which is consisting of all the 193 countries of the United Nations. The General Assembly, in the meantime, has adopted 3 resolutions that are really very forceful. The first resolution, beginning of March, 141 countries voting to condemn very explicitly Russia for its military aggression and its violation of the United Nations Charter, asking immediate withdrawal. I can tell you, if you compare that resolution with the very timid text that was adopted when Russia annexated the Crimea in March 2014. I mean, this is a much stronger type of text. A few weeks later, same General Assembly asks for humanitarian access to Russia with a very strong majority again. Then, on the 7th of April, the General Assembly suspends Russia's membership in the Human Rights Council. A much slimmer majority, as I expected, because that, of course, then if you vote, you are seen that you're in a particular camp. And so there you had much less countries, 93 countries voting in favor of the suspension, 58 abstentions, big group, 24 against. And by reading into the voting behavior of United Nations General Assembly resolutions, it's very interesting to see who is where, at what camp, who are the ones who want nothing to do with the whole thing and want to abstain or simply not come to the room to vote, but also the ones who are voting against together with Russia. And I mean, you see all kinds of interesting dynamics there, but at least the General Assembly has proven to be able to play its role. We call this the so-called Uniting for Peace mechanism. When the Security Council is blocked, that the General Assembly may take a role in matters of peace and security. Until now, it's working. Similarly, also in other international organizations, things have happened. Remember, Russia was kicked out of the Council of Europe. And I guess rightly so, because how can you defend continuing membership of an organization that is based upon the respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law? And so there again, the big question now, of course, for the future will be to what extent will the multilateral system continue to function at the global level and at the regional level? We heard President Biden, when he came to Brussels, he was basically calling for expulsion of Russia from the G20. Didn't work. Well, we expelled Russia already from the G8. And you know that since 2014, the G8 is not meeting anymore. It's again just the G7. In the G20 case, it's a very different matter. And it's very interesting to also see how the so-called BRICS countries are behaving vis-a-vis Russia. India was already mentioned. China, of course, has refused to choose sides, has been also very adamant in the recent EU-China summit. What about South Africa? South Africa, too, was not really on the Western side. And then Brazil is, of course, in a very special type of position. But so, I mean, there are clubs, of course. There are all kinds of regional alliances also on the Asian side. And especially in Asia, it's clear that many countries have refused to choose sides and are really watching very, let's say, eagerly the whole conflict to see what will happen. And especially, as we know, for China, this is an enormously important test, because if China ever attacks Taiwan, they will probably face a similar scenario. And so for them, it's a big learning exercise. They're watching very, very vigilantly. Probably also this panel discussion.
Yes, sure. Yes, sure. I'm sure they are. But let's move to that, because I wanted to discuss the issue of China also from an economic point of view. There are talks about two economic blocs emerging. A bloc led by the US and Western nations in general, and a bloc led by China. And we're talking about economic blocs, not only political blocs. How do you see that happening into the future? Do you see globalization turning into a sort of different bloc structure, possibly with different degrees of integration? and also different organizations, economic and financial organizations attached to them?
Is the
Elina?
question addressed to me or to
No,
Elina?
to Elina first. I want to repeat the question to you, but later on.
Elina.
But first to Elina, do you think that economic interests of China, for example, go into that direction or not?
Well, China will turn out to be the only buyer and the only supplier to Russia, right? So they are potentially facing a very attractive situation on the one hand. On the other hand, they have the threat of secondary sanctions. And all of us already watched Yellen's speech the other day at the Atlantic Council, which has shot a very clear arrow that direction, sort of trying to separate friends and enemies, and also threatening secondary sanctions if there need be. And the US has done so in the past, including with Iran, and it can be very persistent. So on China, the issue here, of course, export controls, even that were now used very actively by US, but also by Europe, originally were sort of perfected with China's case, and China definitely remembers that. So for China to continue imports of commodities from Russia now is something that can receive much cheaper. It's very attractive, especially Russia will be diverting there. We already see the discounts that we see of for example, for oil, Urals versus Brent, it's $25+ of a discount. So it's having an impact on Russia. However, for example, with oil or even gas, the ability of Russia to divert, just like for Europe, it's challenging to pivot away from Russia. For Russia, it's also challenging to do this tectonic shift and push away from Europe, because their infrastructure is mostly geared from the sort of more European part of Russia towards Europe. And a big chunk goes via pipelines. It goes via pipeline to Europe. Some of it, of course, is seaborne, but again, it goes via ports closer to Europe. So for Russia, it has only one pipeline that goes towards China. It doesn't have the capacity at all to replace European exports of oil. And then if they would like to ship it, then what? You're going to go from the European ports and you're going to travel around when it's eventually no longer frozen over, right? Or it's going to go through Suez Canal and around India and eventually it will be extremely expensive and difficult. So yes, China is between the rock and a hard place. And I think that's why we have seen very careful communication, very purposefully obscure communication on foreign policy on one hand, and very strong statements behind closed doors in various organizations on the other hand. So this is China's position. And then, of course, there are technical issues of, on one hand, having enough capacity to ship to China. And then from China's side, they might also want to think about their energy security. They do not want to import too much from one single supplier. They have sort of like an informal, unspoken rule of about, I think, 15% of total energy imports. They do not want to exceed that substantially with Russia. So that's it's a multifaceted conversation, but definitely China's role is very important.
And do you believe in the possibilities of these blocks being structured economically, looking into the future, one led by China and the other one by the US and Western nations?
It's already looking this way. I don't need to believe it because we're already seeing it. You see different countries drifting different directions, and Jan described it, how it works in the voting process. But in economics, it's even more clear cut. We have Latin America is absolutely agnostic, right? We have countries in Africa that have their concerns with food security and other direct relationships with Russia and China, that they've been forced to choose, especially in case of China, they've been forced to choose whether it's the West or China. And the African countries, many of them were saying, wait a second, well, you have to also offer us benefits. China is offering us many benefits. Then, of course, we have MENA bloc, where Russia did a lot of homework with OPEC plus. Just like as they fell out of the G7 plus, they shifted to OPEC plus. And then we're seeing that MENA countries are sort of also trying to stay agnostic and pragmatic. So we're already seeing, I think, this separation. How successful each one of those blocks will be remains to be seen. Obviously, the West has much stronger power, especially that Europe and the US stay united economically. One cannot surpass that. Whether you talk about trade or reserve currency, there is no real alternative yet to the Western bloc.
Yeah, and Jan, I was looking at the correlation between the vote in the General Assembly of the UN and the countries that have joined the One Belt, One Road initiative by China. And the correlation is very strong. You have lots of African countries voting or abstaining and joining the initiative. Also, the same in Asia, and the same, by the way, in Latin America, where a number of countries as well belong to this initiative. Do you see the prospect of a second Cold War? I mean, and I am speaking not only economically but also politically, to big areas of influence in the world that have security objectives, that may also have some ideological flavor behind. It's not going to be like in the past, but anyway, I mean, China is proposing a sort of capitalism which is different, and which in which the state has a very strong role, not to talk about other political features. How do you see that moving?
It's a very interesting but also very broad question. First of all, yes, it's striking how many African countries have abstained in the General Assembly. But that, of course, in the first place shows how much Russia has invested in its diplomatic relations with those countries. Maybe less so about China's relations and the One Belt and Road Initiative. But that's, of course, I mean, these are similar patterns. These countries depend on big investments from those countries. These are also being more or less autocratic countries. They do not come up with human rights and kind of conditionality when they give funding for projects to those countries. And yeah, it's actually interesting to really analyze the voting pattern to see like which of those countries are genuine liberal democracies. Because what we are indeed, when we are talking about new blocs, we are seeing this kind of division between a world of liberal democracies versus a world with more let's say autocratic regimes, and then it depends very much on the interests of the various countries, what side they want to be in. Let me also point to another very interesting phenomenon that has been going on for quite a while, and is not immediately related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but still it's striking to see how the OECD now, just a few days, 22nd of February of this year, the OECD invited Brazil, Argentina to really become serious about joining the organization. So it already accepted Costa Rica as its 38th member. So there too, we see a tool for the West to broaden up a kind of, a community of, call it like-minded democracies, economic liberal countries, and so on and so forth, spreading the OECD disciplines. And I think this really will continue. It may not take the shape of a kind of new international organization of democracies. That's an idea that Americans, and especially the Republican Party, has been, in a way, considering for a very long time. But we all know it will probably not happen. And besides, it's sometimes very difficult to see which democracy is really a well-functioning liberal democracy. We have also some challenges within the European Union in that respect. Mm-hmm. But so, I mean, yes, I think we will see something of blocs emerging. I just hope that all the achievements and benefits of what I would call the global international trade order that we have quite successfully constructed with the WTO after the GATT and so on in the past 25, 30 and more years, I hope that will not disintegrate, because then we will see very harsh, brutal practices. Then we're a bit back to the law of the jungle, whereas we created the World Trade Organization to have more rule of law in international economic relations.
Yeah, I was mentioning before we started this expression used by Janet Yellen in a conference last week in Washington, which is the plurilateralism. And you said that it has some memories in the Clinton administration in the past. Can you tell us what is the meaning of this and how this relates to a new architecture of international cooperation?
Well, there have been many different concepts used in the course of different administrations. Let me put it this way. Multilateralism has been something of a creation also of the United States. Let's not forget that it was the US which was at the foundation of the United Nations after the Second World War. It was the Truman administration that was at the start of, say, the North Atlantic Alliance and so on. So, I mean, lots of international bodies and organizations, including the Bretton Woods institutions, have seen their creation with very strong American support and leadership. Now, the Americans are also a bit specialists in becoming the most heavy critics of the organizations that they have created in the first place. It's also this kind of love-hate relationship which we have seen. But I think indeed it's going to be very important for the international organizations that we have to continue to function, if only as a platform for, discussion and for dialogue. Just imagine that Russia would indeed not participate anymore in the United Nations. I think it would be a real disaster. I think the UN has been created. The very composition and way of functioning of the Security Council, however imperfect we can consider it, has always been part of a package deal that the big powers had to be on board, because otherwise we are back in a scenario of the interbellum period between the First and Second World War, where we had the League of Nations, but with no real commitment and participation of the big powers. So it's very important to keep the big powers on board, however imperfect the work of a global organization is. But then, of course, also the big question will be, what about, the G20, for instance? How can the G20 still work? Can Mr. Putin still appear on a tweet on the G20 summit? I think that has now become very, very difficult. So, I think there will still be a disciplining effect. You cannot just act as if nothing has happened. It will have an impact upon the work of global and of regional organizations. And in any event, I think it will really deepen and hasten the bonding between liberal democracies, for instance, in the context of the OECD.
When they talk about plurilateral, it's a sort of only or multilateral only for friends or something like that. It's an idea of more restricted multilateralism to countries that share the same values.
Yes, but that has indeed been the thinking for many years, that, say, from multilateralism, they went to what Hillary Clinton once called smart multilateralism, which was already a kind of, making alliances with friends depending on the subject matter and the issue area. There was also, at a certain moment during the George W. Bush administration, talk about minilateralism. And minilateralism sounds a little bit minimalistic, but that's exactly what it is. If you look back at some of the initiatives that the Bush administration has taken after the attacks of 9/11, it was really picking and choosing your allies and then, going for sometimes very, let's say, informal types of arrangements in order not to tie the hands of the superpower too much. So, yes, picking and choosing and depending a little bit on the issue area, choosing different allies is really nothing new in US foreign policy.
Yeah, and in fact, the G20, when it was created as a meeting of ministers of finance, I remember listening to Larry Summers about the process of creating the G20, and it was a sort of, minilateralism. It was a sort of getting together with friendly ministers of finance. Another thing is that some of them may go rogue, no? But as it is happening with Russia and maybe with another country or other countries of the G20. But let's move back to economic concerns, and there is a question here coming, and I encourage all the audience to make questions, and we still have 10 minutes left, and we can go through some of these questions. There's a question about the impact on the war in the energy transition, which is a key issue, not only in the connection with the war, but globally, and in the connection with climate change. How do you think, Elina, the war will impact this process of energy transition? May we have some bridge technologies like nuclear playing a more important role, or how we can connect this with the commitments that we already have on climate change, how this is related to energy sovereignty, which is a concept that is also coming to the front of us?
Well, I think it makes it more urgent, more complex, and potentially more beneficial for Europe. So why more urgent is because we understand now that reliance on fossil fuels from Russia is just is something that we cannot continue because of our because of our values. And I think that's first and foremost. Why does it make it more costly? Well, because we already signaled with Green Deal to a lot of other energy suppliers that we're not going to be coming to them in the next 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. So that means that other energy suppliers to Europe said, wait a second, then we have to extract what we can from you at the moment with the spot prices. And that's why I think some of the gas price increase before the war of Russia's war in Ukraine already started happening before. And part of it could have been reaction to Green Deal. In parallel, we're talking about the multilateralism. Other countries approached some of the European suppliers like Algeria and said, wait a second, I'm here for you. China, I'm going to invest into your infrastructure and I would like to have a long-term contract. So that's why I think coupled with the war and the Green Deal, I think energy transition potential is becoming much more expensive. And that's something that hasn't been communicated to the voters on the continent, right? So that's why it makes also the transition more urgent. You're correct to point out that different countries will have to think how they complement this transition in the near term. And here, I think, again, coming back to fragmented Europe, we already see now each countries are beginning to act individually in response to Russia's war in Ukraine. It's Italy one way, Spain another, Germany is thinking something else, Hungary, of course, thinking something else entirely. Well, so you see, you do not yet have any coordinated response from Europe on this front. And why would the coordinated response from Europe be important? It has strong implications for competitiveness of Europe going forward. So cost of energy is much more expensive. We have a disadvantage versus the US already. On top of that, we have this the cost of energy security and ethics of where we procure our energy. So more the reason for Europe to think together and move to renewables, potentially increasing competitiveness of the continent. And otherwise, there is a risk of losing out to everybody, including to our partners across the Atlantic.
Yeah, but no matter what we do, the energy invoice is going to be much more expensive and add to the inflation concerns that we have. We have to manage this energy transition and at the same time build more energy sovereignty in relation to rogue countries. I'm afraid that inflation is going to pay the price. Do you think so?
I think inflation is definitely the big prize, but at the same time, you will have different factors working now. So inflation will be the concern, and also there will be a dampening effect on growth. And I think that's one of the reasons some of the sort of German industry is not very happy about this high energy prices, because they're already feeling the hit before even we move to the next stage of potential sanctions on Russia, right? So I think these two effects, that's what makes the job of the ECB so confusing and difficult. And to be honest, they are right to say that, look, we're going to be maybe not maybe say it differently, but we're going to be data dependent and maybe we'll sit tight for a bit longer, because they are not yet sure whether the dampening effect on growth will be more superior than the effect on inflation. So, but yes, we will have a difficult transition period ahead for us.
And also possibly the kind of compensation mechanisms that have to be agreed for emerging economies to work on the transition might be delayed. And although that can be also something to play with in a new sort of distribution of power in the world economy, that we become lots more proactive in providing resources for the energy transition to developing countries.
I would like to see more proactive distribution of burden within Europe, starting with the small objective here. Of course, there is an important role of the multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank supporting the low-income countries, as well as, of course, commitments to these institutions, the special trust funds, or directly to countries that are going to hit and they're going to have a massive food security crisis. This is for the low-income emerging markets. This is probably the key issue, more so even than the energy prices. And Russia is the largest wheat exporter Ukraine is a very important wheat exporter. Russia is already banned wheat exports. What's going to happen next year? It's going to stop planting so much wheat because the local producer will respond. And even if they don't ban exports next year, they will just have nothing to export. On top of that, you have fertilizers, and Russia is already banning fertilizers, and Belarus is another important supplier. So this is a food story that we're already at Malta at 30-decade high on the food price index, right? Even in real terms. And this story is just beginning. So of course we'll need to increase our commitments, especially to the poor and low income globally, not even talking about big emerging markets, but the most vulnerable around the world with access to food. But on the fiscal policy response and burden sharing within Europe, if I wake up one day, all of us wake up one day and then figure out that actually it's possible and it's happening, I will be the most proud European out there. Because for now, we're seeing very fragmented response from Europe.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. And I hope that in these spring meetings, there is an initiative to cover for especially those vulnerable countries in terms of food security. It will be very much welcome. We have to remember that a lot of political crises in developing countries have come from food security issues, and that is really a time bomb. And Jan, I have a question here from the audience I want to share with you. But first, let me draw your attention on a comparison I read one of these days on the China-Russia relationship from the point of view of international relations. There was someone saying that China taking Russia as a junior partner, if you want, resembles like Germany taking Austria-Hungary as a junior partner in the First World War. I mean, in the sense that Austria-Hungary was a very sick country already, politically and economically, and meant a big burden to the coalition. Does this metaphor, historic metaphor, resound to you, or you believe it doesn't make a lot of sense?
I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's always attractive for experts to come up with comparisons. Like, I mean, some experts in Belgium have likened the sanctions that we are imposing on Russia with the sanctions that the US had imposed on Japan after its invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s, and that this, in a way, triggered, the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor and so on. I think you really have to be very careful with those comparisons. And, history may have similar patterns, but then we live in a very, very different world compared to the world of the First World War, which doesn't mean that the current situation is not very, very dangerous. And again, just imagine that something runs out of hand, that for Russia, the war is such a disaster that they will, in a certain way, out of pride almost, have recourse to some tactical nuclear weapons, that they will even launch something of an attack to a particular country belonging to the EU and or to NATO. I mean, you should not exclude anything. And I'm not entirely sure whether we are fully prepared for that. European foreign policy has always been a very reactive foreign policy, and we're doing a good job right now. But you have to continue to understand that if you look at the basic mechanisms for EU decision-making, in many of those areas, common foreign and security policy, defense, many other areas, it's still unanimity-based. So 27 sovereign countries each have a veto right upon common decisions. You have heard what Viktor Orban has said after he was re-elected. He said, well, forget about future sanctions against Russia and so on. So let's not forget that we are actually a very fragile organization as European Union. Let's also see what happens with the French presidential elections and how this will affect EU decision making. So yes, for the moment there is unity. It works, and we are keeping it up. But when things become much more complicated, when harsh winter weather will appear and we are in need of energy, when we have to keep our population okay, and we don't want to have new gilets jaunes type of uprisings in various countries, and political parties, populist parties, or other forms of political movements taking really, building, capitalizing on all this dissatisfaction and frustration, then it could quickly go down the hill for the European Union. So I absolutely agree that we have to build unity, but we also have to really reflect on how to improve our decision-making capacity. Because if we are not doing that, and we are continuing to operate based upon unanimity and veto rights, then I don't think there will be a strong, sustainable response of the European Union to any of those crises.
Yeah, that also affects the UN, by the way. We rely on veto powers by rogue countries. It is impossible to make it effective. And I think that you answered very well to the last question that I had here, because it was precisely asking why we are not so good in preventing conflicts like this, and we have to take reactive measures because our governance is very imperfect, and we need unanimity in order to take really serious measures, and that only happens when we are with the disaster in front of us. Okay, I think we are in the hour, and it has been really a pleasure to talk with you. Many issues have been very well explained by your interventions, and I am extremely grateful on behalf of Esade, on behalf also of Engage, our student association that is also participating in the organization of this debate. I think that we have all learned a lot of things, and the Esade community is extremely grateful to your contribution for this webinar. Thank you so much, Elina. Thank you, Jan. A pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure and honor.
Thank you so much.